This podcast is on research design in social science research. Here are our learning outcomes, explaining differences between quantitative and qualitative analyses, explaining how different research designs influence how we collect and analyze data, explaining how different research designs influence the conclusions we can make, describing specific types of research designs, classifying a study based on its unit of analysis, and explaining the role that ethics plays in developing a research design. To review, we've been working our way through what is called the scientific process, and this is a way to systematically develop hypotheses to test using data that we collect, and we make conclusions based upon our hypotheses test results. We have worked on asking a research question in step 1. We've developed a theoretical argument, step 2. We've derived hypotheses based upon our theoretical argument, which is based upon our research question. So you can see the scaffolding that has taken place so far. We're working on step 4, research design, which is to set up a design that allows us to collect and analyze data related to your hypothesis, or your hypotheses, excuse me. Here's an example hypothesis. As GDP per capita increases in a country, the level of democracy increases. Recall that GDP refers to gross domestic product, which is the total amount of goods and services that a country produces in a set time period, in this case a year, and per capita refers to dividing that total number of economic product by population, so that we're not just simply measuring the population of the country. So as the wealth of the country increases, the level of democracy in the country increases. In other words, wealthier countries are more democratic. That's the hypothesis. Thus, we would gather data on GDP per capita for countries around the world, and we need a measure of democracy. We've already looked at Freedom House democracy. We also have polity, which is a measure of democracy that is out of the University of Maryland, created by the late great political scientist Ted Gurr. And it's a variable that measures the level of democracy in a country. This particular data set, this polity data set, stretches all the way back to 1800. So if a country was in existence, was sovereign in 1800, it has a democracy score from that time period. But we're interested in 2022. So we're gathering data on GDP per capita and polity ratings of countries in the year 2022. Your research design has a direct effect on your ability to find support for your hypotheses. So choosing a good research design is very important. If you collect data that is inappropriate for your study, you cannot find support for your hypothesis. Thus, getting this design correct will lead you to gathering correct data, which will lead you down the right pathway in this scientific process. There are a number of choices involved in a research design. We have to consider, first of all, what are the number of cases or data points that we are going to analyze? Are we going to have a large number of cases or a small number of cases? We'll provide examples of this as we go along. Another choice is data collection method. How are we going to go about collecting the data? Are we going to do it ourselves? Are we going to rely on some other data collectors to give us the data? A third choice has to do with the who, what, and when of analysis. That is, we're identifying who we're studying, what it is about that who that is interesting in terms of our study, and when is our study being conducted. So in that previous hypothesis, our study is being conducted in 2022. But of course, there are a lot of studies that have other time periods for their collection of data. Other issues to consider when we design our study. external validity and internal validity. So for external validity, can the results from the study be generalized beyond the study? If that's true, then we have high external validity. In other words, and that's one of the goals of scientific research anyway, is to be able to make a generalized statement about a larger population based on the close study of a smaller sample. So external validity is important. Internal validity is another consideration. How confident are we that changes in the independent variable do lead to changes in the dependent variable? How confident are we in that? So that's a question for internal validity to address. So let's start with the number of cases. If we have what is called a quantitative research design, then we have what are called a large number of observations, or in shorthand in social science, and natural sciences as well, large N studies, and N refers to the number of cases, number of observations. If we have a large number of observations, then the only way that we can effectively analyze them is through statistical analysis. So an example would be, well, we could survey roughly 1,000 people and ask questions about voting behavior. That's an example of a quantitative large N research design. On the opposite end of things, a qualitative research design has a small number of observations, or small N studies. If we have a small number of cases, then some sort of numerical analytic technique like statistics will not work as well. There will be too much error, and we'll be too uncertain about our results for it to be effective. So we do not need statistics to analyze qualitative data. We can use techniques such as thick description in order to best understand, describe, and analyze data. An example of a qualitative design might be in archival research, analyzing government archives and government documents to assess why a world leader decided to go to war with another country, or why that leader did not go to war with another country. So you can kind of come at it from two different angles. But the idea is that we're not quantifying this thought process, or this political process, or a sociological process, or whatever term we're going to use. Instead, we're going to look through documents and try to piece together a causal chain of reasoning. And that's called qualitative research design. So the quantitative design I've got listed in terms of pros and cons and a brief example. So a real pro of the quantitative large N design is that it has stronger external validity. It's because we're asking more people to participate in our survey in this case. It's also the case that large N studies might produce clearer results because we have a larger slice of the population to look at. So stronger external validity, able to generalize to a wider population. The weakness is that we have relatively weak internal validity. In other words, the information that we gather at this very broad aggregated level is fairly general, not all that specific. So weaker internal validity is the case when you don't have as much specific, detailed information about each individual participant in the survey. So we have a survey of about 1,000 people in our example. Ask 2 questions about income and protest behavior, and we find that people with higher incomes were more likely to protest. But we did not probe or ask detailed questions to find out why the respondents protested. We assumed instead that under the control variable, income was the reason that people did not participate in protests. So we can apply statistical findings to the entire public, which is strong external validity. We cannot really necessarily find a causal relationship between income and protest behavior because we do not have a very dense description of the thought processes of each of these 1,000 individuals who are surveyed. Thus, strong external validity and low internal validity. And qualitative, small n study. So the pros and the cons are the opposite. The external validity is weak in a qualitative small n design, but the internal validity is actually very strong. And how does this work? So we can interview two people. We can ask detailed questions about their protest behavior. In our example, the participants explained that money-related issues, impact their ability to protest. So, can't afford to protest as much. So we can confidently conclude that income impacted their willingness and ability to protest, stronger internal validity, but it's hard to generalize this to other individuals on a larger scale, or weaker external validity. Now we come to the next point, data collection method. We can look at this in terms of primary versus secondary data. So for primary data, these are data that we actually collect ourselves. In other words, it's a survey that we have written ourselves. That type of data collection can be very time-consuming and expensive. It can run into the thousands of dollars. The National Election Study, run by the NSF and Stanford University, runs in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. So it can be a really time-consuming and expensive enterprise. We would also need to get approval to do the study. We need to work through something called an Institutional Review Board, or IRB, in order to get approval. IRB pays attention to the treatment of what are called human subjects in our research, and raise a critical eye to those studies that haven't factored that in. Well, another issue, is that with the surveys, we have to figure out who the respondents are. And we have to potentially pay them to do the survey. So that's also a big challenge. The next podcast will go over secondary data collection in social science research.